Nigel Farage is going to talk for about 15-20 minutes. I will then pose some questions, and then we'll be opening it out to the audience here. I'm glad to see quite a lot of civil servants here, because that's particularly what we target at, because the theme of today is very much what should happen in government. Nigel Farage.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you for inviting me. The thought that UKIP would ever be invited to something like this shows you that things have moved on. I'm not going to pretend for one moment that UKIP will form the next government. That isn't going to happen. But we may be in a position where we can affect what is in the manifestos of the other political parties, and perhaps after May of next year, we may have some UKIP MPs in Westminster that will have something to say. Who knows whether deals are to be done. So how we view government and how we view the state of our democracy is clearly going to be potentially important. It perhaps won't surprise you to hear me say that there is a major crisis, there is a breakdown of trust in this country between the voters and the government and the apparatus of government. The old age of deference has died. The idea that, you know, whether you get a government that's elected with a blue rosette or a government that's elected with a red rosette, it doesn't matter that much, because they would always do what was best as they saw it in the interests of the country. There is now a very large swathe of the British population that does not believe that to be the case. In fact, I suppose the primary argument is, if we're here talking about government, it's a pity we haven't got one anymore, because we've given away our government. Most of the big decisions, certainly in commercial life in this country, virtually nothing is now decided by the British government. It's not debated on the floor of the House of Commons. It's not voted on, because we have, to a very large extent, given away the running of our commercial lives to a new set of institutions based in Brussels. Now, I know that in the debates that I had with Nick Clegg in the run-up to the European elections, debates for which UKIP are truly, truly grateful to Mr. Clegg. But in the run-up to that, Nick said, oh, well, it doesn't really matter that much because only 7% of our laws are made in Brussels. I think that's perhaps a statement that he's come to regret. How much of our law is made in Brussels is, of course, a very difficult, debatable point. It depends whether you include traffic regulations. It depends how you view it. But I think it would be a huge mistake whether we're in favour of this new form of European government or whether we're against this new form of European government, a massive mistake to underestimate the importance of it. The most definitive study on this was actually carried out by Raymond Herzog, the former German president, who looked at national legislation in Germany. All right, we accept it's different with the Länder. Mind you, we've got devolution here too. But, and when Herzog looked at it and looked from 1998 to 2006, his conclusion was that 84% of German national law was made by the institutions of the European Union. And yes, of course, Germany had a say in all of this. And that figure has not been questioned or not been debated in Germany. So whether we're talking about employment legislation, whether we're talking about Britain's ability to strike trade deals, whether we're talking about agriculture, whether we're talking about fisheries, whether we're talking about huge swathes of our green policy, the first thing for us to recognise is we're not actually a self-governing nation, and clearly UKIP primarily believes that we should be a self-governing nation. There are lots of things we can do at a European level, there are lots of things we can do at a global level, but we should be doing these things through intergovernmental cooperation rather than a form of political assimilation that we're signed up to, whereby we give away those powers. Who knows, perhaps Mr. Cameron and Herman Van Rompuy are having this very debate in Downing Street as we speak, though I doubt it. So that's the first thing. I want us to be a self-governing nation and not one where most of our laws are actually made somewhere else. But I think the feelings within this country about the way in which we're governed and about the ability of ordinary individuals to change anything actually go far deeper than just the big question of sovereignty and the big question of Europe. We have had a coming together of politics in this country over the last couple of decades, where everybody seems to be fighting for this mythical centre ground vote. And voters, I think on really big questions, you know, voters ask themselves, Did it really matter who we vote for? Is it actually worth the bother of going out and voting? And this particularly applies, I think, to the younger section of our society. You know, 60% of the under 30s have not voted in the last 2 general elections. Is that because young people today don't care about politics? Well, certainly going around the universities and schools and sixth form colleges, I think they care as much about issue-based politics as they ever did. But what they do is they sign up to protest groups or action groups or campaigns or crusades, and they see that as being actually a rather more valid way, perhaps, of getting their concerns dealt with, rather than engaging or joining political parties or being part of that process. And I feel, and not just for young people, but in fact across the board, that perhaps we need some complete redefinition of how our democratic system works. You know, we've lived with, for centuries, the idea that we send the representative, not the delegate, the representative to Westminster, and he, and in more recent times she, will make decisions on our behalf and be judged once every 4 or 5 years at a general election. And I actually don't think that system has served us very well. I don't think we would have given away so much power to Brussels. I'm certain we wouldn't have opened ourselves up to open door immigration in the way that we have to nearly 500 million people, had people at general elections really had an opportunity to have their say. And so what UKIP are going to propose in this area is something radical. Radical in that we've never done it before, but perhaps not particularly radical in the sense that many other European countries, in fact, have this model. Switzerland, of course, being the most famous of all. And we will, and as I say, I'm not laying out our manifesto today, but I am laying out, Peter, our direction of travel as we head towards that general election. But there will be a commitment in our manifesto for us to campaign for direct democracy. Now, does this mean that I think there should be a referendum every Thursday or every Sunday? No. Do I think that the people should be able to call a referendum on an issue that is frivolous or doesn't command a significant degree of public support? No. I see direct democracy working, actually, as a very valuable safety net for when the political class have got too far out of touch with public opinion. So the idea that I would throw onto the table would be that the way to trigger a national referendum would be for 5% of the electorate to sign up to a validated petition. Now that would be 2.3 million people. And if you think about it, to actually mobilise and organise and validate 2.3 million signatures, which would have to be collected in the space of 4 months or 6 months or something like that, would not lead to us having frivolous referendums. It would show that there was a genuine disconnect between the direction our government and Parliament was going and how people felt on a very big particular issue. I suspect one issue on which the British public have felt very strongly over the last decade or more is the whole question of foreign military interventions, an endless series of them, most of which it seems to me have made the world a far less safe place than it was before. And I suspect if we'd had the ability, through direct democracy, to hold our governments to account, we would not have bombed Libya, we would not have even considered getting too heavily involved in Syria. So direct democracy, that's the model that we wish to push for and want to campaign for, and we think it would actually make people genuinely feel that they would be able to hold government to account and not have to wait once every 5 years for what, frankly, on many of these big issues is a limited choice. And I also think there's a massive loss of trust, perhaps unfairly, actually, but generally MPs are a pretty despised bunch. MEPs are even more despised, I can assure you. And whether it's the expenses scandal or whichever way you look, there is a loss of trust in career politicians, in the people that we have in the House. And in the wake of the expenses scandal that the Daily Telegraph exposed, I'm pleased to say I was the first person on any form of national media to talk about a system called recall. And everybody sat there sort of open-jawed. What's he on about? But of course the system that's been used quite effectively in America to recall governors. So I did, I think, play a part in getting recall discussed through the national media. There were already one or two backbench advocates of it, Douglas Carswell perhaps being the best known one. And as we led into the general election and indeed the coalition agreement, there was quite a widespread agreement that recall is something that we ought to do in this country. Now, I would apply exactly the same principles to recall that I would to direct democracy on a bigger scale by saying, you know, we would not want this to be a frivolous number of electors that called needless series of by-elections. And it may be something, you know, if we're aiming at a threshold of 15%, let's say, of electors in a constituency, you know, it may be something that could be subject to abuse by a campaigning organisation, and we'd have to look at it and review it. But I do think actually giving electors the ability to sack their MPs in between elections is something that would be enormously popular and would make people feel engaged, you know, within politics, and perhaps it would get them voting in more elections. I suspect that if recall was available at the moment, there is a South Coast constituency, former well-known naval dockyard, where this campaign, I say former, where this campaign would in fact be very active right now. So we're going to campaign for recall, and we're going to point out that the coalition actually have let us down very badly on this, because this was a promise that they made to us. They've actually done damn all about it, other than saying that if we move in this direction, it'll be a committee of MPs that decides whether there's the need for a by-election, which frankly I think would make people even angrier. So we're going to campaign for recall. And we're going to campaign for a more open and a more democratic style of government. And actually, UKIP have started that process already. We've done it in Norfolk County Council, where people were astonished to see that UKIP did a deal with Labour, the Greens, and the Lib Dems against the Conservatives in Norfolk, and we have broken their cabinet style of government to reopen it up to the committee system. We don't like cabinet government at county council or district council level. We feel that a more open committee system, in fact, gives the public greater access to the real debates on issues that affect their lives. So we've done it in Norfolk, and we've also succeeded in breaking cabinet government in Cambridgeshire as well. So we view those as perhaps being our first two significant successes in terms of changing things at local government level. And I think on the broader issues of influence over government and public opinion, there are perhaps two other areas that we want to try and open up for debate. You know, we all take the NGOs, the powerful NGOs that we see have such a big influence over national debate, and we think in turn over government policy, be that in Westminster or in Brussels. But these NGOs are part of our daily lives. We see them all the time. We're often accosted on the street, not by political canvassers, but by representatives of the NGOs trying to extract money from us. They're quite good at it, really, aren't they? I know I've signed up to things over the years that perhaps I regretted afterwards. But these are household names. And we're talking about the Oxfams, and we're talking about the Greenpeaces, and we're talking about War on Want, and we're talking about Help the Aged. And they're all organisations that I think the British public feel are independent and are funded by them. And actually, when you drill down and you examine it, you know, the RSPB, and I could go on with a list of these organisations that do actually hold, I think, quite an important place in terms of our national debate on the direction of government and what we're trying to do. When you actually drill down and look at how these people are funded, you discover that the few bob you gave them outside Charing Cross Station isn't actually how they're funded. They're run by secretariats of extremely well-paid people, and they're funded by government. But government actually is funding the lion's share of these organisations, and it's doing it at a national level, but it's also doing it at a European level. And I couldn't work out for years in Brussels why, when once a year in December we get the annual revision of the fishing quota system, I couldn't for the life of me work out why Greenpeace's criticism of a discards regime that has been in place now for nearly 30 years, that has led to the British fishing industry in the North Sea throwing back far more dead than it was allowed to keep alive. I kept wondering why the criticism from Greenpeace wasn't stricter, wasn't sterner, until I saw the very large sums of money that they actually get from the European Commission every year. So I'm not for one moment suggesting that we close down Oxfam or anything like that, but I do think, given the influence these organisations have over public opinion, it is a fairly bizarre state of affairs to have the government effectively funding the organisations that lobby it. And I think that relationship is much too close and is unlikely, as I say with my Greenpeace example and fishing quotas, to perhaps give us the level of debate that should be desired. And lastly, I would say, well, what about the quangocracy, the quangos, which have become bigger and bigger and bigger since 1997. Occasionally we're promised a bonfire of them. We very rarely seem to see any of that coming into being. They've been used as a wonderful, for the political class, wonderful system for rewarding various people that have perhaps been helpful to their parties. And estimates vary as to what it costs to run the quangos in this country. Some people think it's as little as 60 or 70 billion sterling a year. Others think it's up to 120, 130 billion sterling a year. And I don't know the answer to that. But I would suggest, and we're not there yet, that one of the other things that we will lobby for in the run-up to the general election, and perhaps after that general election, is a radical cutting back of the size, the money, the funding, the power to make decisions of those quangos. So I would sum up by saying that I think UKIP is in tune with the public on this regard, that there is a fundamental breakdown of trust in the way in which we're governed. There is a feeling we're not necessarily getting value for money. There is a growing understanding that actually huge swathes of our civil service, in fact, enact laws that are actually made somewhere else and not made by a sovereign parliament. And I think if we did get back the sovereignty of Westminster, put into place a form of direct democracy to act as that safety net if things go wrong, give our voters the ability to recall their MPs, and examine how various NGO pressure groups and our quangos are run, and work out whether really we think that's the way national opinion should be influenced, then I think that's a recipe for actually bringing back a bit of faith and a bit of trust in this country in the way in which we're governed, and I think would be a better, healthier, and more democratic place for it. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Nigel. Plenty of meat there. I mean, you may be, as you say, just giving us a direction of travel,
yes.
But you've gone past a few signposts on the way. So can I go through those signposts? Because the direct democracy, looking at it and how it works, on the whole, it's been a negative. It's been stopping people doing things. I mean, under your model, how would you, for example, decide how much we should spend on health? Should you put the choices there? Because it's not just a matter of saying we want to spend X amount on health. It's also a matter of how you raise the money for it.
I think the point about my model of direct democracy is that we don't govern through direct democracy. We use it, as I say, as a safety net. Mm-hmm. We use it as a backstop position if the public feel that the political class and the government and Westminster have become wildly out of step with them. And actually, I mean, in many ways, that happens. Switzerland use it a lot. They do use it a lot. But you're right. I think direct democracy in this case would be to stop government doing things, not to make government. You know, we're still going to have general elections. We're still going to have manifestos. We're still going to have governments, or perhaps even more coalition governments, as the years go on. And it's up to government. It's up to government to put before Parliament and get accepted what spending on the National Health Service will be. And it's actually very difficult to envisage a situation where 2.3 million, which is my starter, but it could be, we may decide that's too low. It's difficult to imagine that actually there would be a lobby big enough and well organised enough in this country to prevent, 2.5% planning expenditure in the NHS for the next year being stopped. So I don't see it happening on that. I see it, on really big, contentious national issues. I mean, perhaps one would be HS2. HS2 might be a very good example of somewhere where enough people might feel, do you know what, we don't need to spend northwards of 50 billion quid on this. There are many other things and priorities that we should have. So I do understand the argument that some will say, well, wouldn't it always be a negative? To which, as a great cynic, I would say, well, actually, there are many things government have done in the last few years that actually should have been stopped.
But isn't the essence of any government looking for very long-term decisions? Because a lot of decisions Britain's got to take are really long-term ones. So say on classic one would be energy. I mean, you mentioned HS2, but equally on energy, where there are short-term costs involved in it if you're going to build a power station or if you're going to be fracking or whatever. But actually, the responsibility of government is to say, we're going to take long-term decisions here. Always the opposition is greater because the benefit won't come for quite a long time.
Yes, I understand that. And of course, that argument is the argument that, in fact, was completely behind the European project from day one. You know, Monet could see this. You know, Monet, he was a very clever bloke. Monet could see. Monet disliked the model of parliamentary government for that very reason, that a decision gets made and the ship steers in a direction for 4 or 5 years, and then perhaps it can tack off in a completely different direction. And that's why the European system was set up, so that when big long-term decisions were made, it was virtually impossible for the electorate to change them, which is why the Commission has the sole right of proposing legislation and proposing its repeal. So I understand that there is a big argument that big long-term responsible decisions need to be taken by government and that actually people can't be trusted with this. But I'm afraid I feel, I think two things I feel. Firstly, I think that bond of trust between voters and government has broken down very, very severely. And secondly, actually, people wouldn't say no to everything. They really wouldn't. I mean, if the voters in Kent called a referendum tomorrow on Manston Airport, I bet you there'd be a huge majority in favour of developing Manston Airport. So I don't think that, yes, there'd be some big long stop issues where the electors might say no, but I don't think, if things are explained to people and they understand, energy, as you say, being a very good example, that these are long-term decisions. I mean, it is possible, and I accept the weakness here, it is possible that the nuclear energy programme could be stopped by something like this. I accept it, but that's the choice we have. We either go for this model, this Monet-style model of what is seen to be efficient government, or we go for a form of government where people actually feel engaged.
But isn't there also a paradox for someone who doesn't like European institutions and believes sovereignty should lie in Britain, with undermining the sovereignty of Parliament?
Well, I'm afraid Parliament has betrayed that trust. As far as I can see, Parliament has betrayed that trust. It has given away something that I don't believe it was actually empowered to do. The whole point about Parliament was we trusted people to go there for up to 5 years, then hand the power back to us for us to make a fresh decision on government. And Parliament, I'm afraid, has gone way beyond that. Perhaps if we'd had a clearer written constitution in Britain, they wouldn't have been able to do that. But I mean, these, of course, are all longer-term things. But I actually now would favour us having a written constitution in the longer term to prevent what I see as Parliament abusing its position.
You're almost after a US-type model, Nigel, because, I mean, just thinking, written constitutions of states. If you go to California, California does have what you would describe in direct democracy. It also has one of the most screwed-up state finances in the US, exactly because of direct democracy. Going back to Proposition 13, I was in California in 1978. Property tax, people were getting absolutely furious about it, but it's absolutely screwed up what was one of the most successful higher education systems. You wouldn't dream of wanting to go to prison in California. It's got some appalling conditions because it's got a screwed up model as a result of direct democracy.
Well, as I say, both models are flawed. We've seen Mr. Monet's model, and that's definitely flawed. Just go to the southern Eurozone to see that. And I accept that there are some risks with direct democracy, but I think there is a greater risk, and that is what we're currently living through, which is a complete breakdown of faith and trust in our democratic model.
What would your positive priorities, though, be for government? I mean, if you were sitting down and say, David Cameron's a little busy with Herman Van Rompuy, your old friend, at present, but if you were sitting down with him and you have a Nick Clegg again, I'm sure he's looking forward to seeing you again. If you were doing that, what would be your domestic priorities for actual substance of government? What would you want to do about health, education and so on?
Simplicity and deregulation. Simplicity and deregulation. I mean, take, for example, the tax code. In 1997, the tax code in Britain was 5,000 pages long. By the end of the last Labour government, it was 12,000 pages long. It is now 13,000 pages long. We have the longest, most complex and most difficult tax code in this country, anywhere, I think, in the Western world. Now, this, of course, is fantastically good news for tax accountants. And there is an industry that has been spawned off the back of it. But I think when you see that actually possibly several million people a year are being taxed incorrectly, that figure is undisputed. I think perhaps that's what you get as a result of overly complicated government. So we would look for flatter, simpler taxes. The fields of education, that is slightly different because we are going to be pushing for the opportunity for selective education to be available to children, believing that the 7% that go to the private stroke public schools now have an advantage that is bigger than it's ever been at any point in time in modern history. And we also feel with education that the 50% target of sending people to university is frankly ludicrous. Far too many people going to university coming out with weak degrees that don't help them in the jobs marketplace and leave them with debt round their neck. But I mean, quite how you get a country culturally to start recognising that skills and trade and engineering matters is not something one government can turn around in one term.
All right, health and welfare. What would your priorities be there?
Well, getting bang for the buck. I mean, you know, we are not going to challenge in any way at all, despite what Labour say, the principle of healthcare being free at the point of delivery. You know, that isn't what we're going to try and do. But we do notice that a massive increase, huge increase in health expenditure since 1997, and for lots of reasons. But when you see that the growth of middle management within the National Health Service is up by 48% since 1997, you do start to ask yourself some questions. Couldn't this be better dealt with? Couldn't this be rather more efficient? And why is it, when we've gone as a European country, by the way, I do think we're a European country, I just don't want to be part of political union. We went from a situation in 97 where we were spending a smaller percentage of GDP than France and Germany on health, to a situation where we're now spending a higher percentage of GDP on health. And yet, if you compare, and some argue the figures are cooked, but if you compare the rates on stroke, cancer and heart disease, you know, we're not performing as well as the French sector.
But the implication of what you're saying is you would like us, I mean, in terms of the state as a whole, only a slightly smaller state.
No, we'd like a smaller state, of course we would. We would like better value for money. And one of the things that may come between now and the election is having, you know, I talked about the quangos, I talked about the NGOs, slightly separate, I agree. But one of the other things that we will look at and talk about is the size of the Whitehall departments.
And what would you do as Whitehall departments?
Well, we haven't reached that point yet, to be honest, and I'm not going to pretend.
Okay, I mean, of course, there has been a massive reduction in scale, certainly in the Whitehall bits. Yeah. So go on to quangos. Everyone talks about bonfires and quangos. We've done a lot of work at Institute for Government on it. A lot of it is a question of terminology. Because if you look at some of the big areas which are state, for example, an area you're interested in at UKIP, which is immigration. The whole series of state bodies to do with immigration, which ran into problems a year ago, with border controls, with and so on. They've been brought back within the Home Office. They're no longer, at least for the time being, quangos. They're part of the Home Office. They're performing, the same people performing similar functions than they were before.
Well, do you know something? I mean, firstly, as you say, do quangos operate outside or do you bring them back into government? But there's also the whole question of outsourcing, which I feel deeply cynical about, because I now see very large parts of the private sector benefiting directly from jobs that we used to think and understand that government did. And this was the Blairite idea, that you would, through this public-private partnership, get better value for money. I'm a bit cynical about it. I begin to think that actually a lot of people have made a very great deal of money out of perhaps not improving things particularly. So I think that needs to be looked at. And I mean, one only needs to cite the PFI deals that we've done on several new national health hospitals to see that actually this hasn't worked very well. So yes, I would like smaller government. We can define government in lots of ways, but I am deeply questioning of outsourcing, whether it's to a quango or to a private organisation.
Because I say in many cases it's a definitional issue.
Yes,
There's a function. UKIP supporters want to have pensions, they want to have passports, they want to have X and Y.
Yeah.
There aren't functions they don't want performed by the state.
No, but why should a private company now be in charge of collecting our annual bill for having BBC television and radio in our houses? I asked that question. I just think a very unhealthy relationship between big business and big government has developed as a result of this policy.
You sound rather a traditionalist.
Well, I think I probably am. Yes, I'm a traditionalist in the sense that I'm not an anarchist, Peter. I don't believe in getting rid of government. I believe in having good, efficient government that acts in the interests of this country.
One thing you mentioned was a written constitution. Again, they tend to actually rather freeze things. I mean, the American example is created in a society 230 years ago. Now it's proved to be quite inflexible in some respects. It's quite hard to adjust. Written constitutions can be flexible as well as guaranteeing rights and powers.
Well, I mean, Ireland, of course, went for a written constitution. Post 21, post the change, the Irish went for a written constitution. I'm not aware of any great debate in Ireland to get rid of that written constitution. And yes, again, as I say, no system is perfect. But I think the ultra-traditionalist would say, no, we've got the most wonderful constitution in the world. It's happened through evolution. And you sort of say, well, can you define it for me? And even the great constitutional experts struggle a little bit to define what the British Constitution is and what it means. So I think there is a strong case for having a written constitution.
When you look at David Cameron and what he's doing as Prime Minister and the power of the Prime Minister, does the Prime Minister have too much power? Because under your model, it'd be continually open to challenge. You'd always be looking over his shoulder thinking, if I get this wrong, 2.3 million people can put a petition, as in California every 2 years, or in Switzerland on the basis of which they do it there, and I'd face a national campaign all the time. It would be quite constraining. You would have quite weak prime ministers, wouldn't you?
In or out of the European Union, and especially out of the European Union, I think it's the floor of the House of Commons, and after that the House of Lords that actually matters, and where big things should be thrashed out and should be agreed. So, I don't want an overweening executive either. Even post Britain leaving the EU, let's say that happens, I hope that happens personally, I don't want an all-powerful executive. I think we can trust, once we've got confidence back in our system, I think we can trust our representatives in Westminster to do a good job. And if they don't, yes, we'll have a referendum. But I don't, honestly, with direct democracy, I do not think if we pitch the level right, and it's not a frivolous number of signatures that needed, I suspect we wouldn't have many referendums. But just occasionally there would be something where government or the major political parties got completely out of touch.
Yeah, but it would be all the time, they'd be behind their thinking, hold on, if I do this, there'll be a call for it. And therefore...
Well, if they're thinking about taking us to war, then the fact they'd be looking over their shoulders is a jolly good thing, in my opinion, yes. Yeah.
What about, for example, Cameron and the coalition come in 4 years ago. They're faced with really severe fiscal problems. They start quite a squeeze on the public spending, but they have to put that up from 17.5% to 20%. I bet you there would be 2.3 million people wanting to do a petition then.
No, I don't think they would. I really don't think they would. I honestly don't think there would be a massive appetite in this country to have repeated referendums every Thursday. They really would not. It would be where something... it wouldn't, a penny up on tax or a couple of 0.5% up on VAT. No, it would be on where, over a period of time, there was a big divergence of view on a major national issue.
We've got a big national issue coming up in 3 months' time in Scotland. You've now, to Alex Salmond-Shagra, got an MEP.
I know, it's rather wonderful, actually.
And a rather unusual MEP. Very much a Scottish voice. How would you vote if you had a vote in Scotland?
Well, again, we're talking about government, aren't we? And the Scots have been offered a false referendum. Completely false. They're being offered independence as members of the European Union. Well, the last time I looked, you can't be an independent nation state and a member of the European Union. So actually, it's a referendum on separation from the rest of the United Kingdom. And I hope, albeit there's only one of them, but I hope the one UKIP MEP can inject that into the referendum debate between now and September the 18th.
Right, I'll come back on some issues, but let me open it up. And we've got some mics there. And also, could you say who you are when you ask a question? Gentleman there. A mic's coming, yep.
Aaron Yamwa, HM Treasury. I have a quick question about your recall system. So, I mean, the idea is that essentially politicians will be more accountable for their decisions, particularly on a local level. But is there not a concern if you have an issue, say, where to increase capacity on in the Southeast Airport, you might end up with a decision that's based on, whichever constituency is more likely to call a referendum rather than what decision is actually best for the country? And have you thought about how you'd deal with issues like that?
Well, I don't see the constituency calling a referendum on an issue. I see the constituency calling a by-election if they feel the man or woman who is the MP, that trust has completely broken down. It's interesting. Several times now, we've had defections from the Labour Party or the Tory Party to UKIP at local level. And in the local newspaper, we've said, look, if you in this constituency are unhappy with my decision, please recall me and we'll hold a by-election. And to date, there hasn't been one. To date, there hasn't been one. Probably some disgruntled people are not happy because they voted for one party and finished up with something else. But to date, there hasn't been one. So I reiterate the point about direct democracy on national issues. I just don't think that people would frivolously try to get rid of an MP on an issue. This is about setting the bar at the right level. I'm completely prepared to accept that that you could get a lobbying organisation of some kind that abuses this position, and if that happened, we'd have to change the rules and set the bar even higher. But I think, I think recall would be used if people were really, really angry. And we have a member of Parliament at the moment who claims he's mentally unfit to stand trial, and yet thinks it's perfectly acceptable that he stays as a member of Parliament. And then during this period of mental incapacity, wrote a withering letter to his local newspaper last week. So, I think there is an example where something has gone quite badly wrong. And I think in that constituency, I really do think a by-election would be called, and I think that would be a good thing. But I accept, this is potentially open to abuse, and we'll have to look at it carefully.
Lady there. Done there. Okay.
Thanks, Tamara Cohen from the Daily Mail. Mr. Farage, if you're in charge, would there be any Whitehall departments that you would abolish or merge together, and which would they be?
Well, I've just said, I've come along here today to start off a direction of travel, but before we commit to abolishing Whitehall departments, I think we really need to think about outsourcing, about how much has gone out to other organisations, massively profiting individuals. There might be an argument, actually, that we end outsourcing and bring that back within the role of direct government. So I have not yet reached a conclusion on that issue. Right. We're governed in lots of different ways.
Right. There are a couple over here. Alan.
Thank you. Alan Evans, head of the Scotland office, one of the smaller and most efficient UK government departments.
Very good.
You talked about the referendum and Scots being offered a false vote there, but moving on from that and assuming a no vote in the referendum, what is your vision for the United Kingdom and the constituent parts of it? Are you and your party in favour of the current devolution settlement? Are you in favour of more devolution to Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland? What's your view about the English regions and the English cities? And if you want to, would you like to answer the West Lothian question?
Oh, so just good, simple, straightforward
Yeah,
stuff.
exactly. Yeah.
No, thank you very much. It's very sweet of you. I have to say, whatever the result of the referendum, I think the sense amongst many English people that something really isn't quite right here with this whole imbalance is going to continue and is going to grow. And I represent the one party in British politics that actually has elected representation in all four corners of the kingdom. Only UKIP has got elected representation in Wales, Scotland, England and Northern Ireland. So, you know, we are a unionist party, but the devolution genie is out of the bottle. It is not going to be put back. Ultimately, I suspect the Scots will vote no, it seems to me. I don't think Salmon's arguments on oil, etc., are actually convincing enough or strong enough. But we will finish up with more devolved powers going to Scotland. We will finish up with the Scots becoming responsible for raising more of their own money and for a quite significant, I suspect, recalibration of the Barnett formula. I have thought for a very long time that it's an odd situation where if you're a Scots nat or an Irish nat or a Welsh nat, that's considered to be really trendy and cool and groovy and great. But if you say you're English, that's absolutely dreadful. How dare you? Quite a lot of English people do feel like that. So, you know, the idea that Scottish, Welsh and Northern Irish MPs should vote on education or fox hunting in England clearly is ludicrous. That has to end. My view is we should have English days in Westminster. You know, we can call it an English Parliament for that period of time. My dilemma is this. Whilst that all makes sense, will there then be an insatiable demand for an English First Minister? And if we have an English First Minister for what is 86% of the population, it can be very difficult to see how a Prime Minister and an English First Minister could coexist. And that is, I think, there are some English nationalists out there that would love to see that happen. I'm not one of them. I want devolution to work. I want us to move towards a more federal United Kingdom. But I think the question of the English First Minister is a really vexed one, and one that I haven't yet answered in my own mind. As far as the rest of England is concerned, regionalism, there is no demand for it. I have never met anybody in my life, anywhere in the world, who told me they came from the southeast region. Nobody, although I've been a representative of it in the European Parliament for 15 years. You know, arguably the southwest, Devon and Cornwall, have a regional identity. The northeast, I think, has quite a strong regional identity, and yet when they were asked in Mr. Prescott's referendum for a form of regional government in the northeast, they rejected it massively and overwhelmingly. So, no, I don't think regionalisation is the issue. I really don't think there's any. I really don't see any demand for it. I actually think that counties matter. Perhaps that's an old-fashioned point of view, but I think actually, and not just because I'm a cricket fan, but I think actually counties do matter. And I would like to see, just on this devolution point if I can quickly, I would like to see devolution of power from Westminster to Brussels, devolution of power from Westminster to county councils and district councils who were emasculated during the 1980s in many, many ways. Whether it's uniform business rates or whatever it is, who we vote for at local level means far less than it used to 40 years ago. And I would like to see the ultimate devolution, which is the ability of people on national issues to call, a referendum to stop something from happening.
Andrew.
Thank you. Andrew Garner, Governor here at the Institute. Nigel, you had a good swipe at the NGOs and the quangos. And incidentally, I think your funding figures on NGOs are simply not right. Very few of the big NGOs get a majority or a very large proportion of their funding from government. They get a few percentage. But what both the NGOs and the quangos do is perform functions which government thinks needs to be performed. And rather than, you said that you didn't want them done by bodies outside government, you wanted it to be done in government. Could I ask you, though, to address the question of how many of these functions you want done? Because I spent 35 years as a civil servant seeing ministers say, I don't want this to be done, I want to stop it, and public pressure, the people saying, no, we want this done, we're unhappy. So could you try and lay out what the boundaries of government should be? I mean, what functions should government stop doing? Because almost every party campaign saying we're going to do less, and they don't manage it because actually public pressure is not to do less. So could you give us some concrete examples of current government activities which you would like to see stopped doing, whether it's to be done contracted out or within Whitehall?
To some extent, I've made the counter-argument. To some extent, I've said that I'm actually deeply concerned about the outsourcing of power to big private corporations who make huge profits out of it, and in many cases to quangos who sort of independently on their own act and make decisions. And I know the Daily Mail asked the question, do I want to reduce the size of government? Yes, but we can't just define government as being government departments because of all these changes, I mean, particularly since '97, and the involvement, as I say, of these mega private companies. So there may be an argument that actually we bring this stuff together, we look for efficiencies within departments and try and do the job properly and in many ways more accountably. As far as the NGOs, I didn't have a swipe at NGOs. Now, what I said was we need to have a debate about this because I don't think a very large section of the public actually understand that the European Union and the Westminster government are paying organisations to lobby themselves. And I think there is something fundamentally wrong with that, allied to jobs for the boys and jobs for the family and everything else. I think we need to have a proper debate on that. And the IEA have kicked this off. They produced a booklet last year about NGO capture by government, both at national and at European level. And I think to have a sensible debate about that and whether it is right for governments, as I say, to pay organisations to lobby themselves, I think that's a fair and reasonable thing to be asked to be done.
What would you get government to stop doing? Because your argument requires the state to do less. They do it themselves.
Yes. Well, that means you have to change.
So what would you stop?
Well, that means you have to change legislation, doesn't it? As I say, the tax code in this country needs to be attacked. That's just one example of how government would do less. It would do less because we wouldn't be imposed upon by this bewildering degree of complexity and the fact that millions of us have got inaccurate tax returns every year.
Yeah, but that's the revenue side, but on the spending side, I think what was behind Andrew's point was what would you spend less on?
Foreign aid. There we are, you've got an answer. No question about that.
Well, that's actually a very small percentage of total public spending. It has risen, but it's a small percentage.
Well, it's still, you could say it's a very small percentage, and it is a small percentage, but, it's still £25 million a day.
£25 million a day doesn't get you very far.
It'd be a good start, though, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Right at the back, we've got three there. Libby.
Libby Wiener, ITV News. On a current issue, can I ask you whether you think that David Cameron still has any hope of blocking the appointment of Jean-Claude Juncker as EU Commission President, and where do you think he's gone wrong if he fails?
I think he misread the way the European elections were seen in Brussels. I was in Brussels the day after the European election results. I went to the Conference of Presidents meeting of the European Parliament. It was absolutely clear that the big political families in Europe, the EPP group and the Socialist group in the European Parliament, with the Liberal group as well, interpreted that the European elections were all about giving the green light to a candidate to become Commission President. And because the EPP group managed to beat the Socialist group, Juncker had always been their nominee. And I found that day total acceptance amongst the Socialist group in the Parliament that their man Schulz, who they've been backing for a long, long time, hadn't won, and that Juncker should get the job. So I've been in no doubt from that day that the European Parliament feels very strongly about this. There is, well, I guess in all forms of government, but there is an interinstitutional battle that goes on the whole time between the three big bodies in the European Union, and somehow Downing Street just didn't seem to understand what the mood in Brussels was after that meeting. The thing I find surprising is why a Prime Minister who thinks he can renegotiate our relationship and our membership of the European Union should go headlong into a fight that I think he was always going to lose. And I find that a very strange thing to have done. And I think from his own credibility with the British public, it makes his argument that he's going to get a better deal for Britain look very remote. And Mr Van Rompuy, my great mate, is in Downing Street today. And there is a leaked memo up on a couple of newspaper websites this morning saying that Mr Van Rompuy is coming to Downing Street, not so much to talk about Juncker, though it'll be on the agenda, but Mr Van Rompuy is coming to Downing Street to tell Mr Cameron there will be no fundamental treaty change in terms of Britain's relationship with the European Union. So I think the renegotiation position that the Prime Minister has adopted is looking weaker by the day.
Right, further on, next door, yeah.
Martin Brown from Daily Express. I was going to ask something very similar, so I'll just try and tweak it a little bit.
Okay.
If you were in number 10 now, who would you be telling Mr. Cameron and Mr. Van Rompuy who should be the next European Commission President? And if Juncker does get the job, how will that impact government for the next 4 or 5 years?
Yeah. Because, of course, people have got very short memories. Because we did all this before. It was in 1994, and a man who recently died, actually, a man called Jean-Luc Dehaene, was the favoured choice of the Brussels elite, and John Major vetoed him as a federalist, dreadful federalist, and cried great victory in the British press, and all we got was a different shade of federalist in the form of Jacques Santerre, who was such a disaster that it was the one and only time the entire Commission had to resign in disgrace. And that's the truth of it. You know, even if it hadn't been Mr. Juncker, who else would it have been? You know, given that it wouldn't have been Mr. Schulz because the left had accepted that their nomination wasn't really going to get there, it just would have been somebody else who would have believed in the euro, believed in the fiscal compact, and believed in the process of ever closer union. So, you know, what I said at that meeting, the day after the European election results, I said, look, I'm here as a representative of a party, of part of a trend across Europe, a trend on the right, because we see right-wing parties that have done very well, but don't forget the left-wing parties that have done very well. Syriza, Mr. Grillo, you know, parties like that. And I said, I said, if I was you guys, now would be the moment to recognise you've got a problem and to choose a commission president that said, we hear you, and we're actually, rather than centralising power, going to hand some powers back. But no, they have decided they will continue regardless. To that end, not just politically will the opposition to the project continue, but I suspect that I've always thought that what would break the European Union is the economics. And I think the fact that the Eurozone and the Mediterranean has now gone into deflation means that actually, whilst it's not a sort of immediate train crash crisis, I think the disparity between the northern European economies and the southern European economies in the Eurozone is going to get significantly worse. And that, in the end, will break it.
Gentlemen, no, just by you, Kerry.
Thanks. Gervais Bolton, Department of Energy and Climate Change. Working in the field of energy, the message that we always get speaking to investors or energy companies is be consistent. You know, don't mess around with the legislation. Once you made a decision, stick with it, because otherwise it's impossible to make investments. You have no security. So I'm just wondering what the impact would be, do you think, if hanging over you always was the possibility of a referendum, say, on nuclear energy? I'm sure there would be one if you had this system. What would the impact be for the investor community? And how could they make these long-term decisions with the same peace of mind that they might have at the moment?
Yeah, and I completely accept, and we went through this earlier, I completely accept that you know, and I think nuclear energy makes sense, and I completely accept that it would be at risk with this, and I understand that. However, you know, there is another side of that argument, which is that if we were able to make some decisions and stop government committing acts of grand folly, we'd have stopped the wind energy project a very long time ago. Again, it's very, very good for rich people. Marvellous, you know, you're David Cameron's father-in-law, you get £1,000 a day just for siting these monsters on your land, and poor people pay the bill. Wonderful. So I think, you know, I accept that winning with the British public, the argument on nuclear energy would become a greater priority, but we would, with my system, have stopped the grand folly of wind energy. And I have one more question and I must go.
Yeah. We got two more questions. There's one hand up there.
Hello, Matthew Holhouse from the Daily Telegraph. The most notable example of the referendum system working in Switzerland was a ban on minarets. Similarly, in the United Kingdom, there has been high and consistent support for many decades for bringing back the death penalty. Would either of those be considered a good outcome for the United Kingdom? They would possibly be the will of the people under your system.
I don't think there's I honestly don't think there would be any prospect under this system of the death penalty returning, because I think there has been a massive change of social attitudes on this issue. I think from my parents' generation to my own children's generation, this is one of those issues where actually there's been a fundamental change of people's position. And I reflect that myself.
Would that be true of the party?
Yes. Oh, I mean, UKIP wouldn't. There'd be some in UKIP that would want a reintroduction of the death penalty. I think if you had a referendum of UKIP members on it, I think we'd say no.
Just one final question, because I know you've got to go off.
Yeah.
No. Looking at what you've been outlining and your and the approach you've done, it's still very much the People's Party, the anti-establishment, the anti-government, anti-state view. What I still find it difficult to understand is when we're faced with very big challenges, we haven't talked about the challenge economically from China, India and the other countries in Asia, which requires very long-term decision-making on education, use of the development of infrastructure in Britain. I find it difficult to understand how a government which you're influencing would take those decisions as opposed to stopping what you describe as follies.
Well, you could argue that that's a problem with parliamentary democracy anyway. I know we've moved towards the centre, but there was a time 40 years ago when actually we had very big choices to make at general elections, and we went Tory, Labour, Tory, Labour. So you could argue, even with a fully functioning parliamentary democracy, that is a risk. And yes, I accept that a form of direct democracy could make that more likely. Will it make governments, and we had, from the Department of Energy and Climate Change, and you asked the question, and would it make governments look over their shoulders? Yeah, it would, but that may not be all a bad thing. What I'm really saying, I'm starting here today from the position that our faith, our trust, the deferential attitude that the country used to have towards its leaders has broken down in quite a serious way. And I think that by giving people the ability to call a major national referendum or to sack a rotten MP would actually make people feel rather empowered again and perhaps slightly more favourable towards their government and what they were doing.
Well, Nigel Farage, thank you very much indeed. It's been fascinating because we asked you to outline your vision of government, and not everyone in the room would fully accept and endorse your view, but you certainly have outlined how you think government should work in a very interesting way. As you say, this is some pointers along a road, and over the next 7 or 8 months, we look forward to how you take it along the road. We'll certainly be looking at it very closely at the Institute for Government. We may have a few blogs which raise questions about what you said.
Yep.
And I'm delighted you came here today, and we've had some very lively questioning, and thank you for being so open with us.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you. Thank you, Peter.